This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Today it's our last workshop of the series organized by the Legal Theory Group for the Spring Festival. Our subject is post-positivism, legal post-positivism, and we divided the workshop in three sessions. Following, in a sense, Bobbius' classification of positivism, we divided the workshop in ideological post-positivism, methodological post-positivism, and theoretical post-positivism. In the first session, we're going to have the presentation of Karen Petrowski coming from the University of St. Louis. And as respondent, we're going to have Cormac from the University of Edinburgh. And then we will have the other paper, and then a coffee break around 11 o'clock. So if you want to start, Karen. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed the workshop so far. I hope I will set a low bar for the rest of the morning, so everything will be uphill from here. So my paper is called Varieties of Positivism, and it's primarily an exploration of what it might mean to have a post-positivist legal theory or theory of law, but it also looks somewhat at the persistence of ideological post-positivism in contemporary theories of law, including post-positivist theories of law. In an earlier piece, I asked whether legal post-positivism was possible. I offered a qualified no as my answer in that piece, and in support of that answer, I offered a narrow definition of legal post-positivism based on Neil McCormick's self-identification as a post-positivist. In this paper, I'm taking a much wider approach, much wider view of what might count as a post-positivist theory of law, but still with a goal of exploring the utility of that label, post-positivist. The post-positivist label is attractive, I think, partly because of the amorphousness of the concept of legal positivism. As some people have said over the last couple of days, as I argued in my earlier paper, it can be tempting to want to leave legal positivism behind because it's become so challenging to define exactly what legal positivism is and agree on a definition. Positivism in general and legal positivism in particular are more a class of positions with a shared heritage than they are specific, well-defined commitments. Some commentators have tried to organize the concept by identifying different varieties of legal positivism. This workshop is organized according to one such breakdown, Norberto Bobbio's distinction among ideological, methodological, and theoretical positivism. The first part of my discussion in this paper will consider that and other anatomies of legal positivism, varieties of legal positivism, as a starting point for identifying the different forms that a post-positivist position on the nature of law might take. In the second part of the paper, I consider how these distinctions might apply to actual theories of law through a comparison of the recent work of two theorists that has earned the label post-positivist, that of McCormick, his late work, and that of Bruno Latour, as presented in his recent book, translated as The Making of Law. Both theories, I argue, qualify as post-positivist in at least some of the senses I will have considered in the first part of the paper. The more meaningful distinctions between their positions fall along other dimensions. Most specifically, at least in my current thinking about this, while they agree on the need to find a way to bridge external and internal points of view on the nature of law, they propose different ways of doing that. More surprising to me was the conclusion, which at this point is a tentative conclusion, that both McCormick and Latour seem to remain committed to a form of ideological positivism, a form of positivism that many theorists would now consider obsolete. In a brief concluding section, I consider this paradox. I'm still thinking about that particular question and how to present that conclusion with what qualification, so I'd welcome input on that point in particular. The first section of the paper is called Varieties of Positivism. It considers some standard distinctions among varieties of legal positivism, as well as the other intellectual positions to which the positivist label has been applied beyond the sphere of legal theory, and concludes by considering what types of positions might count as post-positivist. The title of my paper was inspired by the titles of two articles written by American legal theorists writing describing the varieties of legal positivism. A 1981 article by Owen Fiss called The Varieties of Positivism, and a 1996 review essay by Stephen Perry called The Varieties of Legal Positivism. Fiss distinguished two varieties of positivism. One was ethical positivism, which was generally an ethical, not specifically legal theoretical perspective, but it included legal positivism as a variant based on, quote, from Fiss, the view that there is no necessary or logical relationship between what the law is and what the law ought to be, what's often referred to now as the separation or separability thesis. The second variety identified by Fiss was cognitive positivism, which emphasizes study of the actual behavior of people and institutions and, quote, places a premium on what is rather than what ought to be, unquote, thus being somewhat more aligned with this so-called social sources thesis. In his review essay, Stephen Perry drew a parallel distinction between methodological and substantive positivism. Methodological positivism was similar to Fiss's cognitive positivism. It was a position on the epistemological approach appropriate to legal theory. Substantive positivism, like Fiss's ethical positivism, quote from Perry, defends one version or another of the thesis that there are no necessary connections between law and morality. So very similar to the separability thesis. Both Fiss and Perry present these two forms of positivism as conceptually distinct, not necessarily requiring commitment to both. A theorist could be committed to one and not the other. Bobbio drew a similar distinction between substantive and methodological positivism using different terms, but he also drew a further distinction between varieties of ethical or substantive positivism, differentiating theoretical from ideological positivism. His methodological positivism, Perry's methodological positivism used the same name. Fiss used the term cognitive positivism for that position. Involved commitment to a value-free scientific approach in studying actual law. Theoretical positivism is a group of substantive theories about the nature of law, including such things as legal commands, sources, systems, and practices. Theoretical positivism corresponds roughly to Fiss's ethical positivism and Perry's substantive positivism. Not exactly, but roughly. Ideological positivism is a theory of the obligatoriness of legal norms. And here I'm quoting from Giorgio's characterization of Bobbio's positions. Ideological positivism is a theory of the obligatoriness of legal norms, quote, according to which existing laws deserve moral compliance. This variety of legal positivism, ideological positivism, does not fit exactly into the dichotomies described by Fiss and Perry. It seems inconsistent with the substantive variety of positivism, which differentiates categorically between law and morality, since ideological positivism identifies law with a certain specific moral obligation. From another perspective, the positions don't conflict. The traditional separability thesis distinguishes non- or extra-legal moral norms from law itself, while ideological positivism simply identifies legal norms as one special kind of legal norm, not with law-independent moral norms. Both the dichotomies of Fiss and Perry and Bobbio's more complex scheme show the stamp of other forms of non-legal positivism, although this particular intellectual affiliation doesn't play a major role in most discussions of legal positivism. Giorgio, among others, has explained the shifts in dominance over time from one variety of legal positivism. Ideological positivism, the general view is that ideological positivism was the first form of positivism to appear associated with Hobbes in the 17th century. 19th century legal positivism was more in the theoretical vein, elaborating systematic theoretical accounts of the nature of law and legal systems. In my paper, I say this phase was probably the first that was labeled positivist by contemporaries, given the contemporary appearance of that term as a label for theories. The labeling might have been indirectly influenced by the originator of the term positivism, Auguste Comte, especially through the mediation of his British admirers, who were considerable, including John Stuart Mill. In the 20th century, again under the remote influence of Comte, the epistemological or methodological aspect, many would say, is now the dominant feature of legal positivism, the dominant variety of legal positivism. Understanding the developmental stages of legal positivism in this manner, as I think many people do, and I think both of the other participants in the workshop today do, is also indebted to Comte's legacy. Comte's systematic theory of intellectual development similarly moved from a phase of non-analytic credulity, which he called theological thought, through abstracted analysis, highly abstracted analysis, which he called metaphysical thought, and culminated in an empirically grounded, instrumentally useful set of differentiated theories, which was the positivist stage of thought in Comte's scheme. So positivism was the culmination of intellectual development to him. In the language of legal theory, this three-stage development has involved an increasing distance from the internal point of view on law, at least in Anglo-American work, increasing reliance on non-legal vocabularies for explaining the nature of law and legal orders. Modern anatomies of legal positivism also show the influence of Comte in other respects. Other than that schematic theory of intellectual development through three stages, the insight for which Comte is best remembered today is his hierarchy of the disciplines. This hierarchy ran from mathematics as the most basic, foundational discipline to sociology, and in later versions, anthropology as the most advanced intellectual discipline. In part through this scheme, and in other ways, Comte also played a key, if not always direct, role in the process by which the modern academic disciplines came to be distinguished by participants and observers from one another. In the early 20th century, this process generated positivist schools of inquiry and analysis in sociology as well as philosophy and other disciplines. These developments don't often get mentioned in contemporary discussions of legal positivism and post-positivism, but they played an important role in my earlier piece on post-positivism, and they also play a framing role for my discussion in this paper. In this context, the notion of a post-positivist legal theory starts to look not more determinate, but less so, because there are so many positions that can meaningfully bear the label positivist. The corresponding post-positivist label can be applied to a variety of theoretical positions within and among traditions other than that of legal theory. These do include positions that renounce or seek to transcend legal positivism in one of the specific varieties outlined above. For example, a post-methodologically positivist position would seek to transcend the assumption that theories of law can be scientifically or otherwise objective. Another way to think about this position, one that's embraced by McCormick, especially in Thomas's reading, is that it renounces the aspiration to a fully external point of view on the nature of law and accepts that a complete account of the nature of law and or adjudication must at least partly embrace an internal point of view. But still, to merit the post prefix, it seems that this position must do more than reject the possibility of objective description. It must also somehow acknowledge the validity of the aspiration to such external description. As detailed in the second section of this paper, that attempt to simultaneously transcend and validate the external point of view is a tricky undertaking. In contrast, post-theoretical or post-substantive positivism would seek to transcend the idea that law and legal norms are autonomous normative orders, without entirely rejecting the insight that legal utterances make claims to autonomy of some kind and are in part defined as legal by such claims. And post-ideological positivism would presumably seek to transcend the claim that law imposes obligations by virtue of its positive enactment or articulation. From this perspective, as Giorgio suggests in his paper for this workshop, it might seem that most recent legal theory, in the Anglo-American tradition at least, has been post-positivist in one or both of the latter two senses. Even exclusive legal positivists like Raz, not to mention people who are usually considered non-positivists like Dworkin, have acknowledged that legal decisions must sometimes take account of and sometimes explicitly incorporate non-legal moral norms. And as far back as Hart, Anglo-American legal positivism has explicitly refused to endorse an ideologically positivist position. Even beyond those applications, the post-positivist label may be and has been used to refer to positions that differ subtly from these specifically post-legal positivist positions. In recent decades, academics have used the term to characterize a set of philosophical positions that question Comte-descended positions on epistemology and scientific inquiry. In this connection, the term has been applied to the positions of a number of philosophers and quasi-philosophers, Quine, Putnam, Rorty, Charles Taylor, and Bruno Latour. At first, it might seem that such uses of the label post-positivism either duplicate the post-methodological positivism position described above or post-epistemological positivism, or simply have little relation to the possible uses of the label in the context of legal theory. The main part of this paper is devoted to arguing that neither of those positions is exactly right. In fact, the theories of law advanced by McCormick and Latour both merit the post-positivist label in some sense and agree on some fundamental and even surprising points, although they do also differ in important ways. In addition, both the McCormickian and Latourian approaches suggest that, contrary to what we might assume, and again, this is hypothesis at this point, ideological post-positivism is not a thing of the past. So, how much time do I have left? 15?
No, like 10 minutes.
Okay. I'll try to be quick. The focus of the second section is on describing the features of McCormick's and Latour's respective accounts of the nature of law. I'll start with McCormick. My discussion of him is somewhat briefer because I assume more familiarity with his position. Among Anglo-American legal theorists, McCormick is the one who has most often been called post-positivist by others, most often applied that label to himself. The justification for that labeling, as Thomas has explained, lies largely in his rejection of theoretical positivism and the separability thesis, and his explicit elaboration of methodological positivism and the sources thesis. The summary that I prepared in this paper focuses mainly on his positions in Rhetoric and the Rule of Law from 2005 and Institutions of Law from 2007, two of his 4 late books that develop his institutional theory of law. The earlier of these books, Rhetoric and the Rule of Law, builds on and updates an earlier book, Legal Reasoning and Legal Theory, which was published in 1978. In Rhetoric and the Rule of Law, McCormick explains his sustained study of legal reasoning as a corrective to earlier legal theorists' overemphasis on the rules of legal certainty or indeterminacy in law to the neglect of the ways in which a functioning legal order has both characteristics, certainty and determinacy. The crucial role played by rhetoric in legal reasoning, legal systems, and the rule of law is apparent, according to McCormick, from both an internal point of view, one that assumes and builds on the knowledge and know-how of legal practitioners and actors, and from a more external perspective. Rhetoric and the Rule of Law is mainly an extended study of the details and mechanics of legal reasoning, the internal side of the law that Hart, for example, addressed mainly in pretty abstract and sweeping terms, without much concern for the actual deployment of specific legal rules and specific decision-making. The bulk of McCormick's book focuses on meticulous analyses of the internal structure of legal reasoning. There's a list of the ways he does this in the paper that I won't read to you on page 10. Despite this focus on the microdynamics of legal reasoning and justification, McCormick also develops explicit positions on some more general features of legal reasoning from a more external perspective. Most basically, he identifies legal reasoning or argumentation as a special case of practical reasoning. In his theory of argumentation, this is one point of convergence between law and morality. Another is his identification of legal justification as itself morally valuable in a specific way, even though he also continues to acknowledge in Rhetoric and the Rule of Law the distinction between legal and moral justification. McCormick, in other words, rejects the separability thesis or theoretical positivism in at least 2 ways without denying the limited validity of that thesis. He also elaborates on and moves beyond methodological positivism in his focus on the forms that valid legal argumentation, as opposed to simple legal rules, may take, and in his refinement of Hart's theory of legal rules to take account of the special structure of defeasibility in rule application. In Institutions of Law, McCormick developed a number of points that he had left implicit in Rhetoric and the Rule of Law, but he didn't depart radically from the premises of that earlier book. Again, in Institutions of Law, McCormick operated partly from an internal point of view, but also from an external perspective. For example, he explored the nature of key abstract legal concepts such as person, duty, right, and validity. From this description that I've just provided, McCormick's claims to have carved out a post-positivist theoretical position seem plausible. He clearly doesn't endorse any of the standard varieties of legal positivism in their pure form, but neither does he reject them completely. And even if it is true, as I argued in my earlier paper, that his institutional theory retains other key features of Anglo-American positivist theory, as I argued in my previous paper, it could also be said that he departs significantly from that theory, especially in his emphasis on the importance of accounting for the internal point of view in a developed theory of law. To the extent that that point, the adoption of the internal point of view, marks his distinctively post-positivistic contribution of legal theory, it's a paradoxical departure. As McCormick acknowledges in both works, despite the analytical allure of the distinction between internal and external points of view on law, it's not always easy or even possible to differentiate those points of view. From the inside, from the internal point of view, legal practices seem to require practitioners to adopt a partly external point of view, a distance point of view on what they're doing. This becomes particularly clear in Latour's work. He makes a similar point. It's also impossible to make sense of the practices of legal actors in all their detail without adopting a partly internal perspective. That same paradox shapes Bruno Latour's otherwise very different post-positivist approach to an account of law. So now I'll turn to Latour. Latour is best known for his ethnographies of science and not his writing on law. And based on those writings, he had been called post-positivist before he wrote this ethnography of French administrative law that resulted in this book published in 2009, translated as The Making of Law. Those who used the post-positivist label to describe his approach and his conclusions were referring to his position as one beyond positivism, mainly in the scientific or broadly epistemological sense. But as I noted earlier, this sense of post-positivist is linked at least loosely to the notion of post-methodological positivism in the sphere of legal theory. The Making of Law contains 6 thematically organized chapters. I'm going to kind of sequentially describe the book, but moving very quickly through certain parts of it to give you a sense of what it involves. The first chapter introduces readers to the French legal system. The focus is on the French system of administrative law and the Conseil d'État, the institution that Latour studied over a 2-year period through participant observation, in a manner very similar to the way he studied scientists and technologists and technology projects. Much of the chapter concerns how the Conseil symbolizes itself, for example, through the image of a Doric pillar that's just free-floating in space, unattached to anything. So in this way, Latour is focusing very deliberately on the internal point of view, how this institution sees itself and represents itself to itself, although he acknowledges his own outsider status. He takes into account much more than what most legal theorists would consider relevant to an internal analysis, though. For example, he emphasizes not just the words that Conseil personnel use to enunciate their determinations, but also the physical surroundings in which they utter and write those words, and the genesis and treatment of signatures on official documents. In the second chapter, he further explores these less familiar internal aspects of French administrative law, and he introduces 2 concepts that are central to the rest of the book. The first is the ambiguity of the French legal term moyen. In the introduction to the book, Latour describes the entire study as a commentary on the word moyen. This, I think, the closest legal analog to this term is probably claim, but it's not an exact analogy at all. The second key concept that Latour introduces is the notion of hesitation as a key legal act. The idea here is that legal action is characterized as such not just by the setting in which it occurs, the personnel involved, or the vocabulary that's used in legal documents, but by a feature of the action as action, specifically as action that has been, by consensus, checked before proceeding. In his 4th chapter, Latour most directly sets forth an affirmative theory of law. This theory centers on the isolation of a set of what he calls value objects that Latour describes as circulated by legal activity. There's a list of these value objects in note 81 on page 16. I'm not going to read them all. Hesitation is one of them. Moyen is another. But a number of other abstractions, authority, progress, organization, and so on, of particular material objects. In this affirmative account of the nature of law, Latour again stresses the links between legal actors and the non-legal world, which had been a topic of a previous chapter, or, in other words, the non-autonomy of law. He also re-emphasizes the role of hesitation in marking legal action as both legal and authoritative. He insists again on the value of an outsider perspective on law. This is a quote from him. In presenting their domain to others, is it possible that lawyers leave out most of the elements that would make it comprehensible, not to experts, of course, but precisely to those outsiders to whom they address themselves, unquote. If the external point of view is not enough for a full account of what law is and how it works, as McCormick contends, neither is the internal point of view enough on its own for such an account, according to Latour. The final 2 chapters of the book explore the connections between Latour's account of law and his previous studies of scientific practice, as well as the relations between both of these and other forms of theorizing about law, including by jurisprudence. Latour notes the presence of an ideology of what might be called methodological positivism in both scientific and legal practice. Quote, both domains emphasize the virtues of a disinterested and unprejudiced approach based on distance and precision. In both domains, participants speak esoteric languages and they reason in carefully cultivated modes, unquote. But the modes of attaining objectivity, and thus the form that something like methodological positivism takes, are different in each sphere. What seems to judges to be a major failure, this is another quote on page 17. What seems to judges to be a major failing is considered by scientists to be their greatest strength. They can only attain precision by progressively distancing themselves from direct contact with common sense and the senses. And that which scientists regard as the greatest defect of law is taken as a compliment by the counselors. They do indeed stick to what can be elicited from the file without addition or subtraction. Here we have 2 distinct conceptions of exactitude and talent, of faithfulness and professionalism. These are descriptions of the internal point of view in science and law, respectively, or at least some aspect of that point of view. In both spheres, according to Latour, the internal point of view itself involves a kind of methodological positivism, characterized by Latour as an attitude of distance and separation, privation. The form that attitude takes, however, and its implications for practice and interaction with other social actors is different in each sphere. Moreover, despite this internalized positivism, legal actors themselves and their internal points of view are neither autonomous nor homogeneous. For instance, Latour thinks that French administrative law bears the stamp of this attitude more strongly than American law does. Latour's own external point of view, which he discusses most explicitly in his final chapter, is as elusive in its own way as this internal point of view that he's just described. And here he describes the dilemmas that he found in trying to write from an external perspective about law. This is the quote on page 18. It is as if there were no degrees in law. Either one is fully into it or one is not in it at all and begins to talk about other things. There are undefined degrees of scientificity, but the law is either present or entirely absent. One can babble about science without being a researcher, but one cannot talk about law without being a lawyer. This is evidenced in the somewhat desperate attempts of commentators to define law. Any attempted definition, as rough or sophisticated as it may be, always ends up resorting to the adjective legal to qualify it. An inevitable tautology is part and parcel of the definition of law. Latour argues explicitly that this paradoxical quality is as present in external theories of law advanced by jurisprudence as it is in those produced by anthropologists, even if the nature of the externality differs between these 2 positions. Even to a clearly external observer like Latour, it is never possible to describe law from a fully external perspective. This is not just because such a perspective is in theory unattainable or because such a description would necessarily be incomplete, but because the description will invariably draw on the concepts and vocabularies used by legal actors. The external description is also impossible because the spatial metaphor of depth and surface or proximity and distance that's suggested by the internal-external dichotomy is ultimately an illusion or an inaccuracy, particularly in the case of law. Law for Latour consists of a way people behave in certain situations and the way they experience those situations, not a unified thing that can be observed from inside and out. By denying the coherence of the internal-external distinction, Latour may make a more fundamental break with the positivist tradition than McCormick did. At times, to be sure, Latour appears to embrace traditionally legal positivist positions. He insists on the relationship of legal authority to sovereignty, and he distinguishes law from morality. But he still insists on and seeks to demonstrate the value of a perspective that is both inside and outside the legal domain, and even in its internal moments, slightly askew from the vocabularies and concepts used by the inhabitants of the domain. In place of the basic distinction between internal and external, for example, Latour would stress the notion of hesitation as the key characteristic of law as an enunciation regime. This concept of hesitation has no precise parallel in mainstream legal theory or legal discourse. It marks Latour's, what I think is his most successful effort to identify a practice that's constituted of law from the perspective of both internal legal actors who can recognize this practice even if they have no word for it, and the perspective of foreign observers like Latour. So McCormick and Latour's respective theories of law can both defensively be described as post-positivist. Despite the differences in their intellectual and professional training and identities, the two accounts have significant substantive overlap. They both emphasize the crucial role played by discourse, especially self-referential discourse, in the generation and perpetuation of legal order. They both implicitly contend that a good legal theory must engage in microanalysis of both this discourse and its relation to purposeful human interaction. They both stress the importance of clear distinctions between legal and scientific truth. The differences between the theories do outweigh their similarities at first glance. Given the vast differences in training and career path between McCormick and Latour, it would be hard to expect otherwise. But two differences seem especially important. One is the difference in their stances on the utility of the distinction between internal and external points of view. As I suggested earlier, although McCormick is sensitive to the difficulties of this distinction, he ultimately appears to consider it worth retaining. Latour, on the other hand, seems more willing to jettison it entirely, although whether he's successful in doing so is a different question. Another difference between the two is the contrasting use made of the work of each theorist by others. McCormick's work has been more influential among legal academics in civil law systems, certain civil law systems. It's not widely known or cited among American legal academics, including American legal academics. Latour's body of work has provoked wide controversy and discussion among a diversity of academic communities, including American academic communities, but not American legal academic communities either. It seems, based on that very quick summary, that Latour's more external accounts of law and social system, more generally social systems and practices of knowledge generation and control, speak to a wider range of readers than McCormick's, even if Latour's readers by no means always accept his methods or conclusions. As I would suggest in the brief concluding section of this paper, this unsurprising and seemingly superficial difference between the two theorists' work may suggest important lessons for less iconoclastic legal theorists, in the sense that it suggests important similarities between their positions, further, deeper, important similarities between their positions. And that similarity is, I'll try to quickly summarize the last three paragraphs, is that both McCormick and Latour's accounts of law seem to remain ideologically positivistic in some sense, or at least to assume that ideological positivism is far from an obsolete position. This might seem implausible. Most people would think that ideological positivism is not a position that anyone currently holds. We all know, it would seem, that law at least sometimes imposes no admitted obligation on us. But both McCormick and Latour seem committed to assuming the continued, if intermittent, existence of ideological positivism. Both struggle to explain the deep attraction to this position that seems to remain for some actors, both inside and outside the law, as well as the law's apparent continued response to and feeding of that position. In McCormick's work, the struggle is most apparent in his discussions of the necessary universalizability of legal rules. In Latour, it's most pronounced in the list of value objects he defines as constituents of the dynamics of legal action. In other words, neither theorist is able satisfactorily to discredit the notion that legal actors and those subject to the law must at least sometimes remain ideological positivists in order for a functioning legal order to exist. They must at least sometimes apply and obey the law just because it is law, not because it is correct or just by some other standard. I think I'll stop there, and if there are questions about the rest of the paper, I'll answer them.
Thank you, Karen. Now we have a response by Cormac.
Thank you. I should start off with a caveat. I'm not a legal theorist, so if I can adopt a Weilerism, I think Weiler's essence is still floating around here since he visited last week. I feel like a public law Daniel in a den of legal theory lions. Nor am I a McCormick scholar, so it's even worse. I'm a public law Daniel in a den of McCormick scholar lions. So feel free to talk amongst yourselves during this presentation. I enjoyed this paper a lot. I learned a lot, and I'll probably also be propagating heresies for those of you familiar with McCormick's work. it provides a very useful conceptual ground clearing with respect to positivism and how it's used in legal theory, as far as I'm aware, defining or categorizing three different forms: methodological, cold, value-free analysis of the practice of law. The second, ideological, I prefer the term normative, I think is probably the most interesting form of legal positivism there is. For me, it's really the only form of legal positivism. It comes in three strands. The Hobbesian, which I outlined: we cannot agree about morals, therefore we should submit to authority because otherwise we'll kill each other. So there are good prudential arguments for legal positivism, playing out in sources, thesis, separability thesis, and so on. The critical strand, or as I like to call it, playing Radbruch at his own game. If law and morals are the same, then all law is ipso facto just. Therefore, everything that the sovereign says is moral and we should obey it. And this is dangerous because then we lack tools to critique external moral standards with which to critique what the law is actually doing. And the final strand, the Midis Objection, I think most famously put forward by Kelsen: everything the law touches becomes law. So if we don't draw a clear distinction between law and morals, then everything becomes law, including whatever is cited in court, literature, science. If a judge or a lawyer belches, this could also become part of the law. And so we need to keep a clear distinction between them. The third form, the theoretical, was new to me. It was something I wasn't aware of. I still don't completely understand it, and it's something perhaps maybe that people could enlighten me during the discussion, because it seems to me it must necessarily rely on a methodological or a normative positivist standpoint to make any sense. Okay, to move on to the question then of post-positivism, whether it is feasible. Well, of course, whether it is feasible or useful will depend on what your account of positivism is. Which, as you've very clearly put forward in the papers, is not a simple question to answer. But it struck me, though, that post-positivism is least useful with respect to ideological or normative positivism, so the obverse of what I think you're arguing, because it strikes me that normative positivism is categorical. It's a categorical position. It's either or. Law should be separate from morals for all these different reasons, and therefore it doesn't allow for the gradations or matters of degree, or indeed the evolution that post-positivism would imply. So if we have positivism, then there's post-positivism. Positivism is somehow evolved. That doesn't strike me as being capable of being reconciled with the categorical nature of normative positivist position. It strikes me that, and it seems to be the way that you presented in the paper, I think that methodological positivism is the most useful area to discuss and talk about ideas of post-positivism. This comes out very clearly in your really good discussions of internal and external viewpoints, both in McCormick's work and in Latour's work. Latour's discussion, the discussion is really interesting. I have nothing to add. He's an anthropologist as far as I can see, and so I don't know anything about it, so I'll just leave it there. McCormick's, I think it's more interesting. It did strike me, though, from your review of Cormac's work, that he himself is very ambivalent, I should say, as to what his position is in terms of this post-positivist label. He does seem to go for an expanded conception of law, a bit like Dworkin, an argumentation theory of law. Law equals rules plus, as we can see from his analysis of legal argument. But it is unclear what work the label post-positivism does in this respect. Other than just another typology of an integrity or an argumentation theory of law. I'm not sure what post-positivism really adds to this. It seems to be he uses it just as a label rather than a substantive theory. He doesn't, as far as I'm aware, seem particularly interested in unpacking it as a concept of law, but again, I stand to be corrected there. And as he seems to use it very much in passing and in reaction to critique. And this then, to go back to the opening question of your paper, I wonder whether post-positivism is in fact an attractive way of looking at law in terms of thinking of using new ways to think about law, because it seems to me that if we don't properly understand positivism, then it's not a good idea to try and understand post-positivism, because surely we should understand positivism before we start talking about post-positivism. So, thank you.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.